button there. And welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we are talking about xAPI, the basics. I am Ben Saunders and I am the Solutions Manager here at Be Online Learning. So before we go any further, who is Be Online Learning? For those of you attending the webinar who haven't had dealings with us before, Be Online Learning is an e-learning solutions company. Effectively, we have a number of products that we work around, products and services. One of those, which we're very excited and proud about, is our learning platform, Birch, which is a new holistic learning platform which has been developed to make learning feel natural again. We're very excited about that, released late last year and already sort of being taken up by quite a few clients. Very excited about that. We also have a content development capability. So we build bespoke content for clients, and we also have a catalog of online courses that we provide to our clients. With our online courses, though, unlike other providers, our online course catalog is delivered on a basis if we provide the course, but we also give you the source files for those courses. So anyone who's worked with content before will know that what that means is you can update the content going forward yourselves. We also have a professional development side of the business, which is to provide articulate training. So we build content exclusively in the articulate tools, and we've been recognized by Articulate, and they quite a few years ago decided they wanted to make us their certified training provider in Australia and New Zealand, and we're very proud of that fact, that Articulate themselves recognized our skill with their software and wanted us to be the Articulate training provider. But our training delivery goes beyond that. We also provide training around how to build good e-learning content, and that's our e-learning design essentials workshop. And that provides information on instructional design, preparation of content, and what you need to think of when you're building screens and those sorts of things. So that's a bit of a background on Be Online. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Birch down the track as well, because part of what we're talking about today with xAPI directly links into learning platforms that have a specific component. But I don't want to sort of get ahead of myself here. We'll get into what we're looking at today. And what we are looking at today is xAPI. And we're covering three basic areas with xAPI. Firstly, what is it? Secondly, how does it work? And then thirdly, what does it do? And we're going to give you some practical examples of what xAPI can do. Okay. When we get down to that part of the presentation. So when you think of learning, what comes to mind? Is it your 8th grade math class? Is it sitting in a lecture theatre at uni, falling asleep, eating junk food, something like that? Completing your favourite online compliance module every 12 months? Or maybe watching a YouTube video on how to use bulldog clips to repair your lawnmower? Well, in fact, all of these experiences involve learning of some sort, and xAPI is about recording learning experiences, which is why we've highlighted the word experience there in the definition. So what is it? So traditional learning concepts focus on learning taking place as part of a construct dedicated to learning. That construct is typically something like a learning event, a classroom training session, or an e-learning course. Okay. However, learning can happen at any place and at any time. I mean, just for instance, this morning, I've learnt a number of different things. Firstly, I learnt that my wife likes it when I remember Valentine's Day. That was a conversation we had this morning. I also learnt that Theresa May's breakfast deal got voted down again. I learnt that from a paper online. I learnt that Articulate have posted their latest e-learning challenge. I learnt that on Twitter. I learnt that Be Online Learning has had their latest client go live on Birch. Well done, Birch team. And I learnt that via email. And I learnt that our office is almost out of milk. And I learnt that when I went to go and make my tea. Okay, so this is just a small selection of different things that I have experienced this morning, different things that I have learnt this morning. Now, obviously, some of those things are more important than others. Okay, and it's really the more important things that I'm going to remember because they're going to provide some sort of utility to me in the future. So I want you to just take a moment to think about all of the different things that you have experienced this morning and got some learning from it. Possibly this webinar is going to be one of those things. And what xAPI does is it allows us to record those experiences. Okay. Now, obviously, we're not going to be recording things like the status of milk in the office fridge, unless, of course, that can be directly correlated to worker satisfaction or something like that. We're talking about recording experiences that our learners will find relevant because of the possible utility in the future of the experience gained. Okay. So we're talking about things like reading an article or reading a blog or reading some information on a website, possibly completing a survey or looking at the results of a survey or contributing to an online forum or just being part of an online forum, completing tests and assessments, participating in some kind of simulated activity or being observed whilst you're performing some kind of simulated activity. Of course, you've got things like the standard types of e-learning, completing a privacy course or completing a course that you need to do when you join a company or that's based on what your job role or requirements are. You can also be doing things like completing or reviewing or participating in work-related social media. So think of looking at blogs, looking at a work-relevant Twitter stream, or maybe watching some YouTube content. And video is one of the ways that a lot of people are finding out different information and learning things now. And then finally, also doing things like participating in classroom learning or in group sessions or something like that. Now, this is not an exhausting list of experience, or an exhaustive, I should say, list of experiences, but you can see that experiences can come from all sorts of different places and have all sorts of different feedback mechanisms into what we find relevant, what we don't find relevant. So in a nutshell, xAPI records and saves the details of our experiences into a database, and from that database we are then able to record or report on what those experiences were and pull the data together so that we can draw inferences from that data. So how does it work? Okay, so in order to work, xAPI needs to have a standardized approach to recording data. You can't just go stream of consciousness, because if you were just to record what people thought and did and breathed in and breathed out all of the time, you end up with a database full of Marcel Proust-like information that would be impossible to extract and provide any relevant type of reporting from. So what xAPI does is it breaks any type of experience down into 3 different components. And those components are 3 different statements. We have a noun, also known as an actor. We have a verb. And we have an object. And what we can see in the brackets there on the screen is these three statements together go together to build something that's saying, I did this. So very simply, the I in I did this, or the actor, is the person who is having the experience. So obviously, if we're recording data against what people do, we need to know who is having the experience in order to make that relevant at some point. The did in that statement, I did this, or the verb, is what the experience was. And the this, or the object in the statement, is what was the focus of that particular experience. And these different statement types together allow us to do a whole host of different reporting on what people have done. And that reporting could be at a macro or at a very micro level. Think by way of an example of a YouTube video. You can attach xAPI to a YouTube video so you can record whether or not your learners have interacted with that video. Okay. At the macro level, you can have just a straight piece of xAPI code saying that I, or whoever watched the video, watched the 5-minute YouTube video. At a more micro level, however, you can attach your xAPI to that same video, but have multiple different potential outcomes from that. So at a micro level, you could have the xAPI recording that I started to watch the 5-minute video at 10 a.m. And then what I did was I scrolled past the first 3 minutes of the video. And then what I did was I closed the 5-minute video at 10:02 a.m. Now, quite obviously, when you go down to that level of detail, xAPI opens up a whole new world of reporting, because in one case, at the macro level, it looks like I've watched the video, but xAPI allows you to delve deeper into that. And when you delve deeper into that, you find out, yes, I opened the video, but then I sort of scrolled through the first bit and then I closed it after 2 minutes. So I've hardly watched the whole thing. So one of the things that xAPI can do for us is give us that really detailed level of information about what someone has been doing in relation to an experience. And it just doesn't have to be a one-off statement. You can have multiple statements about a single event, watching a video. So we can collect all this amazing data, but then what happens with that amazing data? Well, the amazing data then has to go somewhere, and the place that it goes into is a database, and that database is called a Learning Record Store, or LRS. So just a little bit about LRSs before we move on. The LRS is a database specifically configured to accept and store xAPI recorded experiences. Okay. The other great things with LRSs is they are designed to also communicate and share information with one another. What that means is that if you have information recorded in one LRS because you've performed particular experiences, or you've had particular experiences with a company that you're working for, or an agency that you're working for, when you move to another agency, that data, those experiences, can be transferred from the first LRS directly to the second, in which case your record of what you've done can immediately track you. Now, I know no one likes compliance training, but you can imagine the utility there, that if I was at my previous employer and I've just redone all my privacy and EEO and workplace harassment and all of those compliance pieces 2 months ago, they're recorded in the previous employer's LRS. I leave that employer, I go to another employer, they can bring that information in, which will tell the other employer, well, yeah, Ben's already done all of those things. He doesn't need to redo them. Or at the very least, the only part that he needs to redo is the part that's specific to our new company that he's just joined. So that record can follow you. And when you start to think about it, that sort of provides potentially a record for your training throughout your entire career, from tertiary education, possibly even before, all the way through to when you retire. All the things that you've done, all the things that you've experienced, and all of those different learnings, in brackets, relevant learnings. Okay. Also with the learning record system can sit by itself. So it doesn't need to be attached to any other system. However, there are some distinct advantages of having the LRS built into another platform. And for instance, in our Birch platform, we have the LRS directly built into that platform. So some of the main advantages of having those two platforms combined into one is, firstly, there's no need to integrate with other platforms. I don't know if anyone's in IT out there, but sometimes integrating one database platform with another can be mildly problematic. If both platforms are in the one, then there is no need to integrate. Also, when you have everything in one, both the LMS style functionality and the LRS in the one platform like you do with Birch, then it's much more easy to contextualize the xAPI data. For instance, Birch contains all of the attributes around the learner, not just what their name is and their email address, but their location and their job role and those bits of information. And this allows you to contextualize the xAPI data for much more detailed reporting around that person. Now, even though the LRS in Birch is contained within Birch, it still absolutely allows clients that we have to push xAPI statements from external sources back in. And in fact, that's what all LRSs are set up to do. Take that information and bring that information back into the database so it can be recorded and reported on. Okay, and then that gives us our broad breadth of experience that we can record. So xAPI is code. I guess this is kind of a bit of the white elephant in the room for some people. They're saying this is all nice in theory. Physically, how does it work? Well, at the end of the day, xAPI is code. And it's code that takes the experience data gathered, whatever that happens to be, and passes that information back into our learning record store. So I just want to show you a very quick example of what that code looks like. Now, I'm not here to teach you how to code stuff. That would be obviously a little bit more than is required, or more than is possible within the bounds of a short webinar. What I will show you though is, if we remember back to how the statement is constructed, I did this. When we look at some code, that is an actual xAPI statement, we can see where in that statement those different pieces of content are relevant. Down the track, we'll probably do some more webinars that sort of dig into this in more detail, but just at the very high level. Here's an example of an end-to-end xAPI statement, 50 lines of code. Okay. Now, what this statement does in actual fact is it records the fact that someone has clicked on a button in a web page or in an intranet site or something like that, basically. Okay. Now, like I said, I'm not going to sort of go in and debug this code and talk to you about how all the different parts work and what the code means in detail, but we can see within the code our three statements. That block of code there is the actor, and you can see it referenced in there in brackets, actor. So that is where we're gathering the name of the person who is doing this action. There's the verb up the top there, did. So this was the verb, this is the doing, this is what they're doing. And then underneath that is the object that's connected to the button that they're clicking on. So I did this. In this case, all of that code there tells us that person A has clicked button X. Okay, for whatever that is, to download a policy, to open up a new web page, to complete a course, to do anything like that. But this is effectively what xAPI is. It is code that sits in between the experience and the learning record store, and that allows us to record all of these detailed different interactions and experiences. Okay, so what does it do? And really, this is sort of saying, why is it a big deal? And I think this is the exciting part here. So we're going to look at a couple of different examples, and we're going to look at some examples to each from both sort of the medical world and also from the aviation world. Now, obviously, examples of where xAPI can be beneficial are really, it's up to you. What industry you're in, where can you see a practical application? But we'll just see a couple of examples here, because I think these are great examples that sort of give us an idea of the breadth of what xAPI can do. And we'll start off in the medical industry, and we'll start off with skills-based training, for example, resuscitation skills. Okay, and our xAPI code here might be trying to answer a specific question, like, is the training that we're providing affecting the speed and success of heart attack response? Okay, so when we're looking at this, what xAPI can be doing for us is recording different elements of the training, whether the training is a formal piece of e-learning, whether it's looking at a simulation package that someone goes through, and you can see from the little image on the left there, quite often in hospitals now, they do a lot of their training via simulation, where they have dummies wired up to computers, and the dummy is recording what the trainees are doing and reporting that back. So it can tell if they're doing things in the correct sequence, if the timing of what they're doing is correct. Now, you imagine with our xAPI, all of those different components can be drilled down and then also can be attached to a person, because it's one person potentially, or a number of people that are running through that sort of simulation. And so you can track what their role was. Did they do the things that they were supposed to do in the right order, in the right time, so on and so forth. And then what you can also do with the xAPI is track things like the response time. So all of these, particularly in large hospitals, response time to any sort of critical incident like a heart attack is something that's absolutely recorded, because that's something that they want to report on. Now, when you get these different data sets, what xAPI is going to be able to do is combine those data sets and provide a real-time reporting on what are our current response times. And then if you roll out some training, whether it's simulation or an app or e-learning or classroom training or whatever it happens to be, then you can go back in a little while and check on those same response times and see, has it had any difference? But because the xAPI is recorded against a person, you might notice that person A, who did the e-learning and the simulation, their response times have come down much faster than person B, who just did the face-to-face training. So this is really where xAPI can stand out in terms of getting data and providing analytics around what is it that people are actually doing, and how does that overlay with the experiences, training experiences that they've had. So that's one example in medical. Our next example is looking at something like continuous professional development. So in medicine, as in many industries, like in law or in finance, and we've all seen the Banking Royal Commission come up, they could possibly do with a little bit more CPD training. There is a requirement that over the course of a year or 6 months, a certain amount of training has to be recorded that increases, maintains the knowledge of that professional. Now, that training can be in any number of sorts. So what we're looking at here is for a registered nurse, that's an RN, they need to complete at least 20 hours a year of CPD training. And I've included some examples on the screen, but once again, that's not an exhaustive list. And the training can come from a whole host of different places. So it can be training that is allocated by their manager or work supervisor. It can be things that they go and source themselves. So one of the registered nurses might decide, I want to go and see a particular seminar. There's a new seminar coming up about nuclear medicine, which is all the radiography and those kind of things. Well, there's a new seminar coming up in Brisbane. I want to go and have a look at that seminar, and the time spent at that seminar can contribute to my knowledge and understanding. And absolutely, xAPI can track all of these different kind of components, exactly like we mentioned before. The experiences can come in many ways, shapes, and forms. And xAPI is specifically designed to capture those different types of things. Okay. That's our second example. We'll have another look at an example now, but we're going to switch over to aviation. Now, another thing that's been in the papers recently is the wonderful world of drones and how they can shut down airports and do all sorts of things. And if you go out looking, you'll see that out on the net and in all sorts of places, there is a massive amount of training around how to pilot drones and what you need to do. And there's really sort of two broad areas of that training: private usage and commercial usage. So if you're going to be one of those people that's recording advertisements using the drone hovering over Manly Beach in the morning, then you need to go and do specific commercial training. And there's also a whole host of training just for people who own a drone privately and want to fly it around the local park or fly it over their kid's soccer game on the weekend or whatever it happens to be. Definitely not spy on the neighbors. Okay, so xAPI in that instance, because it can link into all of these different functions like YouTube videos that are out there, or e-learning content that's created by different providers, or different forums and websites, different components of training that are provided in video or other formats by the drone developers or the drone builders themselves. All of that sort of information can be captured and then tracked. And then what can happen beyond that is, because we can capture and track that information, we can see over time how any sort of issues related to drones, incidents of problems with drones, can be correlated back to particular different types of training that people may or may not have used or gathered. Again, because xAPI can be tracked to a particular person. So particularly if you think in the commercial thing here, when a commercial drone license is issued, obviously we know who that is, we can see what their training records are, and then if they fly their drone into the Opera House and create some kind of incident, then you can track back and see what they did or didn't do in relation to getting that particular license. Now, another great example, again, in the aviation industry, and I think this is a really fantastic one, is just the flight simulator. So we know that most pilots go through a flight simulator so that they can continually be training on different weather conditions, different atmospheric conditions, different types of planes that they may or may not be flying. So I guess in terms of the experience, this kind of comes down to a bit of an observational or a simulation experience. And that observational or simulation experience could be either, and you can kind of see on the image on the left there, someone watching the other person in the simulator, giving them different things that they have to handle. All of a sudden there's a crosswind or a thunderstorm or something like that, and then observing how they react to that. But also in the simulator itself, because it is a computer-driven simulation, you can track what the pilot actually did in relation to different things. A flock of birds flies up. How did they respond? A sudden thunderstorm appears. How did they respond? Another plane comes into their airspace and you can't communicate with that other plane. How did they respond? So all of those different data points from the simulation, either recorded by the computer or recorded by a third-party observer, can be tracked back against the pilot's performance in that particular simulation. Now you imagine that's obviously, you know, a pretty large simulator and pretty big computing power behind that, but it's not very far to take that kind of same experience and push it out to pretty much any other application, particularly when you can see that an observed experience doesn't just have to be tracked directly via a computer interface, but it could be tracked by someone with knowledge, a subject matter expert, observing another person performing a task, and then tracking at each part of that task what they did, how they did it, and to what degree were they successful. Remember back to the xAPI, I did this statement. All the different components of a task get broken down into those statements so that the observer can break down what someone has done, possibly recording that onto a tablet or other device so that that information gets passed back into the learning record store, and that gives us that overview of the skill set of that particular person performing that task. So that sort of covers xAPI at that basic level. That's exactly what it is. It's a way of recording experiences back into a database, and then from that database we can pull out relevant metrics and data and report on what people are doing. Importantly, we can report on what their skill level might be at a very micro level. Remember, going back to that video example, you can record xAPI at macro level where you're just saying, did they watch the video? At a micro level, what did they actually do whilst they were watching that video? And that only gives you a much broader and more detailed profile of your learners. And with that knowledge comes the ability then to target more training interventions. If you see that your learners have a gap somewhere because they didn't perform a task up to specification or within the time limit, or they didn't get the right score on a quiz, which questions didn't they get right? Which questions did they get right? Then you can go back in using that information provided by xAPI and target additional training to those areas where there is a gap. So where to from now? Okay. Firstly, I guess if this is something that's new to you, you need to start thinking about, well, how can I apply xAPI in my world? So maybe your learners already have access to certain things where they're getting knowledge and experience. They've already got access to YouTube videos, to Twitter sites and other things. How are you going to get the information out of that? Using the xAPI code, it will mean adding code to those sites. Maybe you need to facilitate that access. So maybe you need to do things within your company to give people more broader access to these sorts of tools, and then at the same time, attach xAPI to those. And I guess probably one of the most important parts about the whole planning journey is what data you're going to record. Going back to my statement this morning, knowing whether or not the fridge has or hasn't got milk and having that experience is going to be pretty much meaningless unless milk is a track of how happy people are or aren't in your business. What you want is quality data that you're able to quantify into the LMS so that you can tell people have done these things and there is an actual meaning to people having done that particular thing, watched the video, contributed to the blog, done the piece of e-learning. Because if you're not recording relevant data that actually shows skills and knowledge, then there's no reason for doing that particular exercise. So you've got to have relevant data. Obviously, you can pull apart what your learners need for their roles in order to find that out. And quite often, that's the case. All of that planning has been done. You can just extend that now to say, well, we know that they need these skills. What's out there that will help them provide these skills? And then start linking to those different elements, whatever they happen to be. And then finally, take all that knowledge experience and then start exploring for yourselves some of the different resources around xAPI. Now, one of the fantastic things about xAPI is that there is a whole stack of stuff out there in the internet that's going to help you. It's not a closed shop. One of the first and foremost places you should go looking is at a company called Rustiki. There's their website on the screen. They are the holders of xAPI. They are the developers behind xAPI. Now, there's a whole stack of stuff. There is their main website at the top there. There is also a sub-site, which is completely dedicated to xAPI. You can go in there, you can see different examples, how different people have used xAPI, where they've used xAPI, and there's also a library of code. So in that site, they've actually got code that you can copy and paste that does certain things already. And you can go in and construct your own xAPI statements with a little bit of programming knowledge, just copying and pasting code from that site. So there's a fantastic amount of stuff with Rustiki. Another great place you can go and have a look at is GitHub. That's their site on the page there, or you just Google them. GitHub is all about different types of programming, and xAPI is only one of the types of programming they cover. But there's some fantastic examples of code that xAPI code that people have used in those areas. And it's one of those things, if you Google xAPI code that does this, then you will find a phenomenal amount of resources around that particular piece of code and some of the code itself. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. Thank you all very much for attending. It was great to have a good turnout for the presentation here. If you're interested in chatting to us down the track, then feel free to drop us a line. We'd love to talk to you about xAPI or about any of the different products that Be Online works with. Birch, our content development, professional development activities, the door is always open for those sort of discussions. Like I said, this webinar has been recorded. It'll be sent out to you guys in the future. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day and have a fantastic weekend.